As a patient or an employee, what's the most insane thing you've seen or experienced in a hospital? I was a patient. There was an elderly man in the bed next to me, waiting to be transferred to a nursing home. The nursing staff treated him as though he was a difficult patient, when in reality, he was just too frail to do things for himself. Anyway, one day, the nurse refused to help him go to the bathroom, as she said he was just being lazy. I could not help, as I was bedridden myself at the time. He took a fall and hit his head on the floor. The male nurse just threw him back onto the bed. His family arrived, and I heard them asking the female nurse, who refused to help him, why their father was so groggy. The nurse lied, saying nothing had happened, and he was fine. I called the man's daughter over to my bed and told her the whole story. Needless to say, the Schmidt hit the fan. Story 2. I was in the hospital for an infection in the bones of my foot. I take medication for a heart condition and diabetes. Nurse came in one evening to give me my medication. She brings me strange-looking pills. I ask her what they are. She tells me 2 medications I've never heard of. I tell her she might have mixed up my medication with someone else's. She says no, she's sure. Take the pills. I refuse. I ask for the head nurse for the floor, or a doctor. Head nurse comes in. I ask her what medication I'm supposed to be receiving. She checks my chart, confirms what I'm supposed to be taking. I ask her to ask the original nurse what medication she has in her hand. The nurses leave the room, and a third nurse comes back in with the right pills. Head nurse comes back in and tells me that the original nurse will no longer be responsible for my care. The next day, the nurse coordinator comes in with a digital audio recorder and notepad to go over all the details of what happened the night before. From what I learned later, this wasn't the first incident with this nurse giving out the wrong medications. She had done it to a couple of other patients, and I heard she had been suspended pending an investigation. Don't know what happened because nobody ever contacted me after that. Story 3. A nurse. We had one guy with a history of severe, untreated hernias who was admitted because one had grown so large, it looked like he had a basketball under his skin and he needed surgery. Well, before we had the chance to get him to the OR, he sneezed, and the stretched skin of his belly just split open like a water balloon, and his intestines tumbled out. It looked like he dropped a plate of spaghetti in his lap. We draped some wet gauze over the area and rushed him downstairs, pretty sharpish. Story 4. I was a patient in A&E, and a young guy came in drunk as all duckery, and he had ripped his sack open trying to jump a bollard. Well, when he saw the needle the nurse had to use to numb his franken beans, old mate was not having it. Cue what was almost like a horror version of a Scooby-Doo chase scene, with flappy sack guy running in and out of rooms sans pants, while getting chased by a bunch of security and nurses. They finally caught him, and he promptly passed out, so they continued his care while he was snoring away. I was just sat in my hospital bed trying not to laugh too hard and pop my stitches while messaging my mom like, "You are not going to believe what I just watched." Story 5. I'm a third-party contract cleaner at my local hospital. We basically clean all the public spaces and non-patient areas. The morgue falls under us. Well, like many morgue, we have a walk-in freezer fridge. Well, one morning as a supervisor was walking past, there happened to be water on the floor coming out of the morgue. It turns out a cooling pipe was leaking pretty bad. So we call the maintenance and repair people and get the water shut off to that area. There was about 2 inches of water throughout, so we cleaned that up. And because the cooling pipe broke, we had to open the fridge and transfer the bodies to the second spare fridge away from the broken pipes, so the funeral people could come and pick them up without going around ladders and construction. We crack open the door to the watertight fridge, and because it was watertight, we didn't know that a second pipe had also broken. Turned out the fridge had flooded as well. Have you ever seen a video of someone cutting a pool and the water running out as well as everything that was in the pool? Well, the water was so high that the bodies were floating, and we had that sliced pool effect as soon as that seal was broken and the door was unlocked. So not only was 5 of water rushing out of the fridge into the morgue and into the hallway, but whatever was floating in that water did as well. There were sheets and gowned bodies that ended up all over the floor, and one actually made it into the hallway. The basement was flooded once again, and that was one hell of a cleanup. Whenever someone says the word floaters to me, that's all I can think of. This happened a few years back before COVID. I almost quit that day. Story 6. While in the emergency room for an asthma attack as a child, 2 teenage boys were brought in by ambulance. They had been huffing silver paint. At first, I thought it was funny because they looked stupid with the paint on their faces. Then, my mom started crying hard. The older of the 2 was DOA, and the younger was screaming, "I can't believe I'm going to die," over and over. I can still hear his voice in my head 35 years later. Even worse is their parents' sobs when they showed a little later. It turned out they were brothers. Story 7. I went to visit a mental health client who'd unsuccessfully tried to end it by severing the major vein and artery on both sides of the neck. This was nothing compared to the guy next to him. A guy working for some cowboy air conditioning company was not given proper equipment and has literally cooked off his arms and legs. He was completely helpless. Still in fresh bandages, he had the most beautiful, caring wife spoon-feeding him. His eyes were glossy as he saw me looking over at him. I gave a chocolate bar to his wife and nodded at him. After this, I told my client that I needed a second and I went out in the hallway and cried like a baby. Story 8. A rogue, wandering cat behind the counter of the closed-for-the-evening hospital shop. There's a set of shelves built into the wall behind the counter that's full of teddy bears and other soft toys, presumably to be bought when visiting a patient. And the cat was asleep amongst the toys. Story 9. I work on a psych ward. I see ducked-up Schmidt every day. Yesterday, I had to take away my patient's wallet because he wanted to order a wedding ring for his future wife, Kim Kardashian. Later on, he used his poo to write M+K on the wall. If you are reading this, Kim, you won't find another guy like him. Story 10. This drove me insane. I had a broken wrist and leg and had just had surgery, so I couldn't go anywhere, confined to bed, and had just got a new roommate. It was an old man who was affected by dementia, I believe, poor guy. His wife came in with a small boombox, which was strange. She immediately set it up and started blaring what sounded like Chinese communist anthems, and were later confirmed to me to be exactly that. These were played on loud 24/7 to comfort him. All we had was a thin curtain separating us, and it was the same 2 or 3 songs on repeat, so by gods did it get old quick. That's not all, though. He'd repeatedly yell for help, every few minutes, as though his life depended on it. I understand this was partially an effect of the dementia, and partially because he spoke no English, and the nurses couldn't communicate to him, so he couldn't understand what was happening. But that also got old fast, and he was worse at night. He'd eventually settle down for a few hours, but even if he slept, I still had to put up with the communist anthems. All the nurses kept apologizing to me. I'd been getting on really well with all of them. They did their best to let me chill, as they knew I was on edge. They knew my moods pretty well. After almost 5 days of this, finally a free room opened up. It was supposed to go to a new patient coming in, but the nurses refused and made sure the room was given to me instead, and the new guy got my room. I was literally going insane and becoming very nasty. Not to anyone, but in my compassion for this guy and his situation, I'd yell and mock the songs. When he'd call for help, I'd yell back to shut up. It was totally out of line and totally not me. The lack of sleep and peace to recover was getting to me. Anyway, I got the other room with this lovely old guy who, despite being rooms away, had heard the cries for help and music, and had been wondering what was going on. I made him keep the door closed so we had our own little oasis of peace and quiet, and luckily he was fine with it. He was a complete gent, and we got along great despite a huge age gap. The nurses would update me and tell me they were doing what they could for the new guy, as he wasn't coping well either, but at least he was mobile, so he could leave the room when it got too much for him. And that's why I never want to hear another Chinese communist anthem ever again as long as I live. Story 11. UK patient in a waiting room. Fellow was sat in the waiting room bleeding from somewhere. Not a small amount either. Completely oblivious to everyone around him, including the nurses trying to admit him. Pretty sure he was on ecstasy as he just sat there gurning and bopping to some music on his headphones. Strange experience to say the least. Story 12. I was working in a hospital and we had a prisoner in the emergency department. We were out of beds, so they had him in a storage closest with 2 guards. I went in to examine him. He had a port for dialysis with an attached tube. He was probably 6'3", 350 eyes. He's cuffed. As I'm examining him, he bites and tears out his tube, and blood just starts spraying everywhere all over me and the guards. The guards were in shock, and I was in shock, and we were all looking at each other expecting each to do something. Eventually, they restrained him, and we sedated him and stopped the bleeding. It was at like 2 a.m. and just an unreal experience. Story 13. I spent 3 months in hospital when I was 18. In that time on the ward, there were definitely some characters. A month or so in, I guess they were out of room in other wards. But around 9 o'clock at night, a man was brought in by a police officer and clearly off his face. He was assigned a bed, left alone, and I guess passed out for a bit. Middle of the night, I hear a shuffling around and wake up. The guy is stood at the foot of my bed, and when he notices I'm awake, starts yelling about how I'm on fire. Everyone is going to die, and tries grabbing at other patients to save them. Security were called, police were called. He was aggressive, belligerent, and even when they got the cuffs on, he was giving his best fight to escape or hurt someone. Don't know if it was desperation, fear, reflex, or what, but one of the nurses just yelled that they were going to call his mother. Instant attitude shift, calmed down, apologized, and started crying. He was escorted off the ward, and I never saw him again. A truly bizarre 4-hour stint in a pretty weird stay. Story 14. Weekend afternoon, one of the first nice days of spring. Slow day in the ER for the most part. When in comes a distressed younger couple with their infant baby, mom is hysterical, and dad is barely keeping it together. Dad gets it out that baby is bleeding from his mouth. I'm skeptical because the baby looks quite happy, but I do see a slight reddish-pink tinge inside his mouth. I take the child and put him down on the exam table, all bright lights and tongue depressors, to get a good look in the baby's mouth. Sure enough, evidence of blood, but again, no baby distress. Oh wait, there's something near the back of her mouth, kind of a darkish red color. A blood clot maybe? Not sure. Have a coworker firmly immobilize the head, and with hemostats, go in and pluck out the object. Amazingly, it comes out in one piece and looks like a plump, slightly larger sized raisin. I can't figure out what it is, but it's definitely not a clot. Into the specimen bag goes the squishy thing. No distress for the baby, vitals normal, breathing easily, happy demeanor, good color, etc. Time to get more of a history from mom and dad. First day outside with new baby and their dog. Enjoying the weather. Baby's on a blanket, giggling as the dog runs around him. Wait a sec, did you say a dog? Let me take a closer look at the thing in the specimen bag. Sure enough, suspicions confirmed. It's a tick, deflated to be sure, but a tick that recently had a large meal of the red stuff. Baby must have pulled it off the dog, and then done what babies do by putting it in his mouth. Story 15. A Vietnam veteran collapsed on the floor of a VA hospital waiting room and having an acute crisis, while VA staff pretended they couldn't see it happening. It looked like he was having a heart attack, and he was screaming for help, and the VA employees just rolled their eyes and avoided getting involved. They acted like he was a toddler throwing a tantrum. He was alone, scared, and in pain while experiencing a medical crisis in a hospital, while the staff acted like he was a burden. Multiple patients jumped up and helped him while yelling for assistance as soon as it started happening and stayed with him until, I think, someone called 911. And then the VA medical staff decided to finally assist because they didn't want to deal with that paperwork, according to one nurse, that watched the whole thing. I don't know what happened or if he was even in danger, but the behavior of the staff clearly showed how little they think of all the veterans looking to them for help and medical treatment. I will never trust a VA hospital or staff after seeing that. Story 16. My now late mother and I were in triage in the hospital, had to wait in the hall to be seen. We were seated next to a man that looked like Bill Fagerbach, actor that was in the movie The Stand, and is the voice actor for Patrick in the SpongeBob SquarePants series. The man looked about 40, and his elderly parents were there with him. Everything was fine and dandy. I was twiddling my thumbs looking down until I hear a nurse speaking with the man. Nurse, what did you eat for breakfast today? Man, a gallon of lighter fluid and 2 bricks. Nurse, okay, and what is your name? Man, Bob Marley Mofo. Nurse, okay, great, I'll be back in a few minutes. I realized I was sitting next to someone who likely had schizophrenia or some type of delusional disorder. It was insane and fascinating how calm and patient the nurse was with him. A few minutes after that, a psychotic woman was being strapped to a bed as she was having a mental break. My mom and I genuinely thought we were accidentally in a psych ward. For years after, Bob Marley Mofo was our little inside joke. Story 17. Doctor's office, not hospital. I was the receptionist and a guy came in with what was clearly whooping cough. He kept telling the people with him it wasn't while in the waiting room. He went back as quick as possible. Doctor said, "We'll call you an ambulance." He declined, wanted to walk out. He collapsed right in front of my reception desk. Luckily, doctor had already called the ambulance and they pulled up very shortly after. Dude exposed an entire family practice to pertussis, including infants. I was an extern, and this was 2017, when I still had a modicum of trust that people weren't this stupid about infectious disease. If that didn't cure me of it, 2020 sure did the trick. Eta. Luckily, this was right before we closed for lunch, and you bet I sanitized everything in that waiting room. Story 18. I was in the ER for reasons, and while in a bed, there was another woman next to me who was very obviously there to try and get pain meds like morphine or similar. She would roll around in agony when a nurse or doctor was in the room, but as soon as they left, she'd be snacking or laughing at the TV or calling someone. A few hours in, she gets a phone call and starts freaking out. Says her daughter was stabbed and she needs to go. I knew she was an addict of some kind, but her fear and panic sounded very, very real. She started calling for nurse to come take her IV out because she had to leave ASAP to go to her daughter. She's crying and ripping out her IV by herself, a whole mess. The nurse who is discharging her asks her if her daughter would be taken to that hospital, and the woman says her phone is dead, so she doesn't know. She's just going to go to wherever she last heard from her. I still think about her and wonder if her daughter was okay, or real even. Story 19. I was in the hospital for a few days with what turned out to be nothing, but one night around 3 a.m., they brought a new patient into my room. As they were getting him in the bed, he started having a full voice conversation about how he felt fine and being in the hospital was silly, in a very polite, calm but firm voice. He started saying that he didn't need to be there and was going home, getting progressively louder and angrier. I could tell from the voice he was an elderly gentleman, and it turned out he had dementia. The weird part was sitting there in the dark as a larger and larger group of doctors, nurses, and orderlies came to try and get him to calm down. When that didn't work, another woman who was clearly fairly high up the authority ladder started talking in a slow, loud, and clear voice, telling the crowd, not the patient anymore, that they were going to restrain and sedate him. She narrated every step while he was shouting and threatening. Very clearly, she was talking to future lawyers and investigators. The whole procedure took more than a half hour while orderlies held him, which was different from restraining him. It ended with something like, "We are injecting him to sedate him," followed by a very quick fade out before they took him out of the room. It was very sad and scary to see, well, hear, someone who had clearly been a fairly smart, self-assured, and independent person going down that road, not understanding what was happening and getting insulted and then outraged by what he perceived as his mistreatment and loss of autonomy. It gave me a sense of what hell it must be caring for a loved one with Alzheimer's. Story 20. Used to be a frequent patient, so have seen some a schizophrenic woman in the ward for several weeks, screaming her head off about everything, including the nurses trying to make her wear a pad, etc. Was walking around the ward and saw the moment a woman passed away surrounded by her family. They were spilling out of the room and into the ward and was wheeled out shortly after most. Harrowing was in her, a man wheeling in and out of consciousness. Wife that honestly looked like she was passing away and slapping her and everything to try keep her awake. Seeing the horror shock and pure heartbreak on his face is just stuck in my memory. Story 21. I was sat in a Thai emergency room, waiting area a few years back, and a guy calmly sat down next to me holding his hand to his face. Lady he was with went up to queue and fill out the paperwork and whatnot. I politely said hi in broken Thai. He said hi back, and we paid no more attention to each other. She got to the front of the line and the triage nurse ran over to him immediately and spoke urgently and rapidly to him. He responded calmly, stood up, moved his hand, and showed her his eye, which was in his hand, dangling from the socket on a long thing. He and the lady he was with treating the whole situation like a minor inconvenience. Story 22. My daughter, who is 13 was having severe abdominal pain. They told me to take her to the ER to check for appendicitis. A PA sees her and says they will start with an ultrasound to see if they can get a view of her appendix, draw some blood, and test her urine. I agree to have all of that done. During ultrasound, the ultrasound tech asked me if they had did labs on my daughter. I said yes. I thought it was an odd question, but didn't pay too much attention to it. We get taken back to my daughter's room. A little while later, the PA that saw her originally comes in and asks me to step out of the room. I question why. Since my daughter was a minor, she said she just had to speak to my daughter alone. I step out thinking she was probably going to ask her if she was sexually actively or something of that nature. So when I walk back in and see my daughter on the verge of tears, I immediately ask the PA what happened. The PA had asked me to walk out of the room and proceeded to tell my daughter, "So there's a baby," and my daughter, who isn't sexually active, says there can't be how. The PA responds with, "By having kex." When the PA saw my daughter's reaction, she allowed me back in the room. She proceeded to tell me that my daughter was 6 weeks, 3 days pregnant. I knew for sure without a doubt that it wasn't possible. In fact, my daughter had just finished up a heavy period. I told the PA that it was ludicrous, and what made her think that she said that my daughter's urine pregnancy test came back negative. Her blood pregnancy markers were all negative, but that she had a sac in her uterus, no baby, and that she needed me to bring my daughter back in a week to assess the viability of the fetus. At that point, I kicked her out of my daughter's room and asked to speak to the attending doctor. The attending doctor came to speak to me, and she stated that there was a group of individuals involved in my daughter's situation: a radiologist, the PA, an on-call obgyn, and herself. The attending doctor said that she tried to tell them that she didn't think what they were seeing was a fetus, but they pushed forward and decided to go and tell my 13 daughter alone that she was going to have a baby. Not only was she embarrassed because they didn't believe her, she was left so confused. Long story short, the doctor comes back and says that after reviewing everything that they didn't think she was pregnant, but that she needed to follow up ASAP because it looked like she had a structure mass in her uterus of unknown origin. That was a Friday. We had to wait all weekend, and thankfully, I got her into my OB-GYN. The following Monday, my daughter had no mass and nothing to be concerned of with her uterus. To say that I was livid is an understatement. They not only challenged my daughter's innocence, but also falsely diagnosed her. Story 23. being told the baby I was pregnant with had no heartbeat from listening with the stethoscope. But because I was admitted through emergency due to heavy bleeding, not the maternity ward, they couldn't get a sonographer to see me for 2 more days to confirm. The nurse then left my husband and I in a room alone for 4 hours without even checking on us, despite the fact I was bleeding heavily and begging them for help. Her words were, "This happens all the time. You'll have another one." The machine was literally upstairs and being used for other women who were admitted via maternity anyway. That baby turns 8 now. So wild how we thought for a day there that he died. And again, during birth, but that's another story. Needless to say, hospitals aren't my favorite place. Story 24. I woke up from brain tumor surgery in a holding pen in the ICU they referred to as the bullpen. It was intended as a spillover area during triage in case of a large-scale disaster. The hospital has been building new facilities, basically non-stop for over a decade, but this very public holding area had not been addressed. There were about 15 of us in there, some having been just brought in by ambulance, some recovering from surgery. I was told I would stay there for 3 to 4 days, until the surgeon thought I could go home. It was like a dungeon. People wailing, conversations and clanging and laughing nonstop. My bed was immediately adjacent to an emergency exit, which had been blocked open to allow staff to use it like a primary entrance, just exit. There was no rest. I overheard a doctor explaining to a woman that her son, who was brought there from a car accident, would likely not survive the night as the mother wept loudly. An elderly patient moaned in agony as they tried to remove crusted bedding from his bed sores. It was beyond hell to wake up from surgery into a dystopian Bruegel painting. I spoke with a traveling nurse who said she would have never accepted the assignment if she had known this was where she would work. She said I was the first patient to make a big deal of it and could not understand why others were not complaining. I am not a complainer by nature. I put up with a lot of Schmidt, and had I been in the right mind, I might have let this go too. But I didn't. I demanded a private room, at least to let me sleep for a few hours. When they said I would be there for days, I demanded to be discharged. The surgeon came in and said he had to give me permission, or Blue Cross would not cover the surgery. But he said he agreed that it was antithetical to healing. The hospital, a large university teaching hospital, did an amazing job in every other respect. But the moment I became unable to do anything about it, they had thrown me in a dungeon. I said I would write to every news outlet and every paper. I recorded some HIPAA violations on my phone that I overheard, told them I had them and that they had already been uploaded to the cloud. Hospital administrators showed up, the surgeon and the aforementioned nurse took my side, and magically a private room became available in 10 minutes. Advocate for yourselves, people. Story 25. My surgeon literally yelled at me right after I got out of the recovery room. I had a surgery. He told me I wasted his time and resources. Nothing's wrong with me, and my favorite, you really need to consider seeing a therapist about your issue. I now have confirmed endometriosis and suspected adenomyosis. He didn't take any biopsies, even though that was the whole point of my laparoscopy. Didn't look behind my organs, which is also the point, and burned tissue without testing it. Realized after he only scheduled my surgery to prove me wrong also. He dismissed me fully, and I kept pushing. He finally agreed, but said, "I know you don't have endometriosis," while scheduling. Yes, I've reported him. Story 26. I was recently admitted to hospital. I was at the time pretty okay and only 30. They put me on a ward with 70, 80-year-old dementia patients. It was 30°C, no aircon, and the windows closed because it was winter and they were old. 2 of them Schmidt themselves, and 1 was telling me to wrap the medical cords around my neck and hang myself. I thought I was going insane and discharge myself. Ended up being cancer, so not the smartest choice, but never mind. Story 27. Worked in it in a hospital years ago. Someone told one of the doctors that the monitor on a computer running one of the medical imaging devices was extremely high resolution. The doctor immediately thought that it was a great computer to surf prawn on. Not just any prawn though, prawn from sites with all sorts of viruses. For those of you that don't know, a lot of complex medical equipment 15 years ago had to run on minimally patched or not patched at all versions of Windows. You can see where this is going. Yes, he infected the PC multiple times, and because it was basically a custom build, we didn't have an image for it, so we had to reinstall everything by hand. The device was down for multiple hours, multiple days, because he wouldn't stop. We knew who it was and talked to him directly telling him to stop, and he refused. It was a small rural hospital that couldn't really get doctors in his field, don't remember which. So I came up with a solution. I ran this by the IT director and CFO to get their blessing first. We knew which sites the doctor was visiting, so I set up an internal redirect for them to go to a page we were hosting on the network that only had a picture of the IT department, looking very upset at the camera. We were not an attractive group of guys. Sure enough, the next morning, we got an angry call from the doctor, threatening to have the CFO fire us all because we were interfering with his ability to access medical websites. I got my boss on the call, and he got the CFO on the call. The CFO started going down the list of the sites that we redirected, all of which were obviously sites that were not used for medical research, and asking the doctor if this was the site that needed to be unblocked. When she got halfway through the list, she stopped and asked the doctor if he saw a pattern in these sites and if he wanted her to continue naming them, because if she got to the end of the list and he didn't fess up, there was going to be trouble. The doctor said that he was good, hung up the phone, and we didn't hear anything about it after that. Story 28. Calling out my dad's doctor publicly. My dad had been admitted after collapsing in pain. He had pursued a diagnosis for his back pain for years, and 6 months prior had reported a complete loss of appetite to his primary care. During the hospital stay, he was diagnosed with stage 4 presumptive liver cancer and given 3 months at best. Turned out to be an accurate timeline. The attending noted the loss of appetite indicating nearing the end. His primary care visited after we received diagnosis, and I went out to ask him a question while he was at the nurse's station. He had the audacity to complain about my dad calling his office to get help when he was in crisis for a previous health scare. His office put the call through to him while he was driving. Apparently, that was a crime and my dad's fault. He actually took out his cell phone and waved it around saying how busy he was. My dad had just been given a death sentence, and this started complaining to me about that call. Whatever, I listened to him rant, and then went off on him. As unbeknownst to him, I knew all the backstory. It was glorious. I hope the nurses saw what a prick he was. I told him he wouldn't have to worry about my dad calling anymore since he would be dead. Duck that guy. I think he was freaked out by how badly he ducked up by missing the diagnosis. The tumor on my dad's spine was so big that later the oncologist said, "We can't not do radiation to shrink it." Not to save him, mind you, just to help alleviate the pain. The loss of appetite was a key indicator that he brushed off as good news to help my dad lose weight. Saw the primary care doc years later in an elevator at the hospital and seriously considered recounting my dad's last days and death, but didn't. I now work at the same hospital and it would likely have gotten me in trouble. Oh, and I found out my dad was going to die when a resident spilled the beans. I said, "So it looks like it might be lymphoma. Treatable." And the resident looked confused and told me it was stage 4 cancer and terminal. He realized he ducked up when I retreated to cry in the small kitchenette off the hallway. He followed me and apologized. I then had to go back into my dad's room without letting on to him or my mother about the news I had gotten. The attending eventually made his way in hours later to officially give us the news. I give the entire experience 0 stars. Story 29. A middle-aged woman came into A&E on her birthday with her son, felt very sorry for him, and claimed she'd lost a vibrator up her bum, had scans and a rectal exam, not by me, fortunately, and was telling the history in front of her poor son that she was pleasuring herself up the arse and had lost the vibrator up there. Turns out there was no vibrator up there, and she'd come into A&E to get her bum fingered. When this was revealed, she was sent on her way. What made it more insane for me was that she was telling the staff all this concocted story in front of her son. Lord knows how much therapy he has had to have by now, if she did this sort of thing on the regular. Story 30. When I was in my 3rd year of medical school, I was on my psychiatry rotation. We were on the consult team for the hospital, so we were called for evaluation and treatment of patients on medical floors who were admitted to the hospital for medical issues, but demonstrated difficult to manage psychiatric symptoms during their inpatient stay. We didn't get a lot of consults on the pediatric floor, but we got one for a little girl who was floridly psychotic. She was admitted for seizures and altered mental status, and the pediatric team was overwhelmed in trying to help this girl. They had done a very thorough evaluation, including a brain MRI, which was conclusively normal. When we first went into her room, there were multiple family members there, but none were speaking. The lights were dimmed and the room was filled on every shelf with battery-powered candles. Lit candles aren't a good idea in hospitals. The family had posted Christian icons and pictures of various saints, as well as Mary and Jesus all over the room. The family was praying silently as we entered. The girl was sedated but semi-responsive as we tried to interview her and get a history, but most of what she spoke was gibberish and word salad. She would intermittent stare off into space and rarely scream, as if she saw something terrifying. Having gleaned very little information and deeply disturbed, we left the room. As our team discussed our differential diagnosis, the list of possible reasons for her altered mental status, it was legitimately suggested and even acknowledged by our attending, who was not an overtly religious person, that demonic possession was a possibility. We made some recommendations regarding psychiatric medications to treat her delirium and hallucinations, but none worked. In fact, many had the opposite of the intended effect. Finally, as it turns out, it was determined that She had a rare type of ovarian tumor that was causing a type of autoimmune paraneoplastic syndrome. She was treated medically, underwent surgical removal of her ovarian tumor, and returned to her normal psychiatric baseline. It was the craziest and eeriest thing I've seen in medicine, and it was also the only time I've ever seen the possibility of spiritual warfare, demonic possession, briefly discussed in an academic center. Story 31. I was interning at a hospital, and basically, I aided nurses doing menial tasks like making beds, delivering drinks or snacks to patients, and even bathing patients. One day I was helping transport a patient for surgery, and the man seemed fine, chipper even. I didn't ask why he was there, so I just did my job. When we made it the area where he was to be prepped, I stayed because I was curious to see why he was there. The doctor pulled up his blanket to reveal his leg, pretty much soaked in blood with pieces of his flesh loose. He accidentally shotgunned his leg and was taking like a champ. All he said was, "It was my own damn fault, so I can't be mad." I have no what he was on, but I wish to be that serene if something like that even happens to me. Story 32. I was in the A&E, or for Americans, when a middle-aged guy was wheeled into the space next to me, yelling and shrieking things like, "Oh God, this is it. Mom, Dad, I'm dying. I'm going to see you again. This is the end," etc., punctuated with a long series of loud, dramatic wails. My initial thought was, oh, Schmidt, I've seen a few people die, but it's never been like this. This is going to be harsh. I couldn't see him directly, as there was a dividing curtain between us, but I could see everyone in front of us. Then I noticed the expressions of stupefied disbelief on the faces of the doctors and nurses, which confused me even more. This carried on for about 5 to 10 minutes. Then the wailing grew more desperate, and he finished off with, "I can see the light. I'm going towards the light. I'm going now. Goodbye, world. Oh," which tailed off into silence. After a few seconds of blissful quiet, he started again with, "Oh, I'm back. It's a miracle. I've been sent back. Oh, glory be." At which point the nursing staff finally snapped. One marched up to him and said harshly, "Mr. Smith, do you understand what's happening?" He said, Oh, yes. I thought I was gone. I've been saved. It's miraculous. I'm reborn. I have a new chance at life." No, what you have, Mr. Smith, is a nosebleed. Story 33. I was in rehabilitation for people with debilitating injuries, amputations, broken bones, ECT, and there was a man who had an incident that turned him paralyzed and basically trapped him in his own body. He had something happen to his head internally, couldn't walk on his own, eat, or hardly speak. I took to reading to him a couple times a week because he asked me to. His name was Connor. We had rehab exercises a few times together. One day I'm down in the exercise part, where they have you work with gym equipment to get your body strong enough to handle whatever injury you're dealing with on one side, and on the other to teach you how to use things to assist with putting your socks on or getting used to moving in certain ways. Mine was a shattered pelvis, so they had me focusing on upper body strength and body mobility. Connor's day started about a half hour after mine. They had been trying desperately to get him as mobile as possible. He had been there 2 whole months before I showed up. So they're putting Connor through his exercises, while another person and I are focusing on our own stuff, and the dude starts going nuts. He's motioning, throwing a fit, trying desperately to get his husband to understand what he wants. Well, what he wants is to try to walk. They have a setup where there's 2 bars, and you walk between them with your weight on your hands and somebody helping you. Connor's people didn't think he was ready for it. His recovery was going to be at least 4 years long, I think. But his husband pushed them to let him try. So try he did. And he ducking did it. He had hella assistance, but he got about halfway across. I've never screamed support for someone so hard in my life, watching him move his mangled body across those bars. I'm so proud of you, Connor. Story 34. I was in the waiting room waiting to be seen for what turned out to be gallstones. Not the most fun I've ever had. A group of young dudes come in. One guy's face and knuckles are all covered in blood, and his shirt is all ripped up, obviously been in a fight. The triage nurse asked what happened, and the guy's mate says, "He fell down the stairs." The triage nurse was like, "Okay, that clearly didn't happen. I need you to tell me exactly what happened so we can triage and treat you properly." And the guy insists he fell down the stairs. Meanwhile, one of the other mates has picked a fight with security for whatever reason. So the whole group arc up and start trying to fight the security guard. So another security guard shows up, and the whole group, including the dude who fell down the stairs, all get kicked out. Meanwhile, another nurse is getting screamed at by a lady whose son apparently came to the hospital in an ambulance. But there was no record of her son being there. There was some other crazy stuff, but I get the feeling that was just a regular Saturday night. Story 35. Okay, if this counts, but I'm gonna put it anyways. I used to work in a memory care facility, and majority of the residents who were there had Alzheimer's, but there was one resident who got in a car crash when he was a teenage and had severe brain damage and memory loss. His parents just kind of threw him in there the day he turned 18, and he was 30 at the time this happened. People with Alzheimer's and people with his condition, not sure what exactly it was called that he developed. Because I was in the activity department, not a caregiver, tend to not really know the line and not to cross it. The line just doesn't exist to them. And he was rolled into this one room that we called the bingo TV room that had like 20 windows in it, so they could see out anywhere and we could see in from any direction. And he was just sitting watching TV. I went in to check on him and talk to him and saw he was just full on touching himself, watching cartoons where everyone could see. Just simply pulled out my walkie-talkie and said, "Hey, insert name here," is touching himself in the TV bingo room, and walked away the second someone showed up. Second one at the same memory care facility during dinner time. This other resident started choking on his food. He was pointing at his throat, coughing, and could barely say a word, but managed to get out that he was choking. At the time, I didn't know how to give the Heimlich, and I was just kind of patting his back pretty hard, trying to help. And when it wasn't working, I ran over to the nearest caregiver and told them what was going on, and this said, "If he's talking, he's fine." He wasn't ducking fine. I then found the actual nurse and ran over to her, and she helped him. I called my boss furious and had to make a report, and Schmidt. The caregivers there, for some reason, always hated the activity department, so that didn't help the situation, but the caregiver ended up getting fired. Story 36. Only 3 weeks ago, I was near one of the hospital main entrances having a smoke and waiting for my fiance to text that he was back from his MRIs and CT scan. I overheard this conversation between two patients smoking against the opposite wall. Patient 1, "What the duck happened to your foot?" Patient 2, "It duck and fell off in the alley off 110th. Had to get my knee stapled together. Duck and bones were hanging out." Patient 1, "Didn't your other duck and foot fall off 2 weeks ago?" Patient 2, "Not the whole foot, just my toes. I can't wait to get out of here and go get high again." Patient 1, "Can't keep doing that one. Duck and arm will fall off next. You won't even be able to beat your meat." Laughs. Patient 2, "Oh, duck, then I'll be in real trouble," and then wheels himself inside. Curiosity got the best of me, so I walked over and asked Patient 1 what drug they were talking about. Patient 1 tells me it's got many names, but local street people call it zombie drug. Apparently it's some kind of drug that you shoot up with needles, and it causes sporadic necrosis anywhere in your body when you overuse it. So if you're shooting up into your left arm, you could suddenly get necrosis in your foot, and then your foot will just rot away and fall off of your body, which is what happened to Patient 2 as his leg fell off in an alley after overuse. Wild to hear such an interaction so casually, like it's a regular Sunday morning occurrence to just have your leg fall off in an alley at it. A Redditor mentioned they thought it was tranq, which is large animal tranquilizers, mixed with fentanyl or something like that. I think this is most likely what the guy was taking, since this combination drug is known to cause sporadic necrosis. Story 37. The hospital I go to is where police bring people that are in custody, so it's not uncommon for a few officers at a time to accompany someone in cuffs who looks like they've been through a lot. Once there was a young girl who kicked the duck out of a nurse in her stomach. The scarier instance was when a very large man broke free, still cuffed, and while sprinting down the hallway, body checking every person in his way into walls, and everyone was just shouting that they didn't know what to do. I was still on a hallway bed, and I could feel the air rush when he passed me. It was kind of crazy. Story 38. I cannot even choose a specific thing to write about. I worked in a nursing home for a while, and it was heartbreaking. I cried during my shifts frequently. The first thing that bothered me was that people weren't treated like people, like they'd get washed up and changed, but the nurse wouldn't even look at them. It was so impersonal. I'd see people getting fed meals while the nurse was on their phone or talking to the other employees. It pissed me off. I don't care if that patient is non-responsive, they're still in there, and the right thing to do is treat them like a person. I would witness instances where a resident would fall, and it wouldn't be documented BC that would make the facility look bad. More than once, when I needed another nurse to help me get the patient up, the other employee would refuse because they didn't like me, and I'd have to go ask someone on another floor to help me, leaving my areas without coverage. I personally preferred the dementia and psych wing that was locked. I was patient with the residents, and I knew the others weren't. I still saw residents being pushed down the hallway at bedtime and yelled at. I witnessed other staff force a patient to wash up and change her clothes without any obvious reason aside from her having been wearing them a few days. It was just a cruel power move, Immo. I reported so many people and so many instances and watched my hours get cut. I wasn't able to help. I tried and tried. I still get sad when I think about it. The institution is stronger than one measly employee, though. Story 39. When I was a tween, I broke my foot, and however I broke it, it didn't swell or bruise at all. It looked so normal that the receptionist ladies were laughing at me for using a crutch we brought from home Lowell. I ended up waiting 7 hours in the waiting room, and when I was finally brought into a hospital room, a kid around my age that had been in some sort of accident was brought into the room next to me and treated before me as his care was obviously a higher priority. After they had looked after him, he looked pretty gnarly, but he was okay. He was sitting in the bed talking to his aunt that was trying to help him with his cognitive function or something. He was doing pretty good, able to have a full conversation with her, but he wasn't sure who she was at first, and he kept forgetting August when she asked him to name all the months, lol. Another story from that night. While I was still in the waiting room, this man had come in with his girlfriend. He had had really bad strep throat for a week. Yes, he came to the emergency room for strep throat he had for a week. In the waiting room, he was all bent over in agony, with his girlfriend rubbing his back and comforting him. It looked like they had just come a fancy event or something too, as he was wearing a suit and she was wearing a white cocktail dress. Meanwhile, there's a guy sitting next to them who came straight from work, jumpsuit, toolbox and all, who had a thumb bandage so big I swear he must have almost cut it off or something. And thumb bandage guy told the staff that we wasn't even going to come in, and his coworker convinced him to and gave him a ride. Story 40. I guess it's not that crazy, but it's the craziest thing I experienced. I was in a room for a week next to a very mercurial dude who swung wildly between being chill and telling outrageous stories and being openly rude and hostile to people. He was making mocking, racist remarks about one of the male nurses, mocking his Indian accent to his face, belittling the female nursing staff, and making inappropriate remarks to them that they laughed off, but you could tell they were uncomfortable. Well, he was on some pain pills and an antibiotic IV, and the IV fell out somehow, multiple times. He kept abusing the nurses every time, getting vicious if he had to wait for his pills for more than 15 minutes or the IV took too long to put in. Eventually, the Indian nurse, after getting absolutely blasted by this rude dude, had enough. The patient had been getting almost screamy because the nurses were too incompetent to do a proper IV because they're all immigrants and foreign. So I guess the nurse decided to try to find a place that it wouldn't just fall out of and stuck it in the guy's armpit. Story 41. I had a patient with autism that a lot of the other nurses, docs, physio, and everyone couldn't really get though to him when speaking because they all spoke at their level, when all he needed was someone to speak to him in a way he would understand. He had a nasty toe infection and shouldn't have been weight-bearing on that foot, but no one could get him to use a walker or cane. All I did was talk to him for like 10 mins about the things he liked to do, found out he was a huge World of Warcraft fan, and played it really well. Well, he was bragging, haha. So I just mentioned that he should think of the walker as a piece of equipment. He found that will give him plus move speed while injured. Not even 30 mins later, I see him going down the hall with the walker and moving without pain. Everyone on the floor was shocked and asked me what happened and how did I get him to use it? Sometimes you have to talk to the patients a little more to find a piece of motivation for them. Story 42. About 15 years ago, my mom fell and hurt her hip. I took her to emergency. She had to spend the first night in emergency because there were no beds available. My mom had a very high pain threshold, so when the nurse came and asked her how much it was hurting, my mom said she would like 2 extra strength Tylenols. The nurse said no and that she should immediately start on morphine. My mom said that was not necessary because the pain was not excruciating. The nurse started screaming at my mom that she had to take morphine. We were both flabbergasted that she had exploded into anger at my mom. My mom was a very strong woman and was not intimidated by her and refused. This nurse went on and on. Finally, she gave up, but looked absolutely furious that my mom wouldn't take it. Fast forward to my mom then in a room with 3 other women, all with similar hip fractures. Again, my mom only took Tylenol or whatever the hospital equivalent was of that. This one nurse treated her terribly. They labeled my mom as difficult. My mom wasn't. She just had all her wits about her and wasn't going on morphine. My mom was the only patient that walked out of that room. One of the women died and the other 2 were completely spaced out all the time and never got up out of bed. My mom has since passed on now. I miss her and my dad every day. Best parents ever. Story 43. There was a patient in Emerge who was clearly not in his right mind and was escorted by 2 police officers. He kept yelling and causing disruptions, demanding to be seen, but the staff kept telling him he would have to wait. He kept getting mad every time they would say that. And after about an hour of waiting, he asked the officers, to go to the bathroom. They escorted him to a bathroom. One went in to check the bathroom and then came out and let him in. A few minutes later, the man walks out limping and starts yelling, "Will you see me now?" He was waving something about in the air, and it took me a couple seconds to register what I was looking at, from the blood dripping down his hand, arm, and down the front of his gown, and the guy slurring his speech and screaming. Turns out he went into the bathroom, cut off his own penis, and came back out, waving it about, demanding to be seen by someone. Everybody jumped up to help the guy. They obviously had him on a gurney and rushed him down this hall within minutes. Never forgot that. It was the first time in my life where I was like, this is the true definition of crazy. Story 44. Not too insane, but memorable to me. I was in the ER as a patient, and there was another patient who kept leaving his room. I overheard him yelling and carrying on at the nurse station, telling them, "You got me all stuck up with needles like I shoot up crack. I don't shoot up crack, I smoke it." I had to stifle my laughter while the poor, exasperated nurses finally got him to calm down and go back to his room. Story 45. One night in the ICU, we had a code blue on a woman. We did absolutely everything, but she didn't make it. Finally, the doctor realized our efforts were futile and we stopped. She lay in the bed. We were all just sort of starting to pick up, organize our thoughts, and wander out of her room to check on the other patients. Then we heard a sneeze and a loud "achoo!" She wasn't dead after all. Her heart monitor started up again and we all rushed back in. She survived. At the work Christmas party the next month, we presented the doctor a pepper shaker and told her to add it to the code cart where we keep emergency supplies. So in the future, in addition to CPR and IV medications, she could just shake a little pepper under the patient's noses to make them sneeze. Story 46. During my time as a patient, I once witnessed a rather unusual incident in the hospital. While waiting in the lobby, a therapy dog accompanied by a miniature therapy pony strolled through, bringing unexpected joy and laughter to everyone. It was a unique and heartwarming moment that added a touch of positivity to the hospital environment, making the experience more memorable amidst the usual medical routines. Story 47. I'm a scheduler at urgent care in a major metropolitan area. I've had patients pull out their phones and film me, telling them they have to wait a little longer to have their ear cleaned because someone experiencing a heart attack arrived at our facility and they take higher priority. I've had patients call me racist because we didn't accept their insurance. Last week, the husband of a patient threw chairs around our waiting room as he screamed at us because his wife did not want him in the room with her during her appointment. Us complying with her demands angered him more. The level of entitlement I see is astounding. You can walk in with missing fingers and blood running down your arms, and some lady in the waiting room will ask why you get to be seen first before her. I went into this field to give my life to the community and to serve the public. I wanted to be a community servant, but now I'm second-guessing my decision to continue with nursing school. I'm tired of getting yelled at incessantly every day by people when you're trying to help them. I'm tired of hearing everyone's political viewpoint on COVID and the ethics of isolation. Now I just want to be selfish and make my money and clock out, and I don't care what I do. Story 48. I was an ear nurse, so I've seen lots of crazy things. But one of my favorites is when I was an EMT based in a part of Chicago, known for a higher population of mental health and homelessness issues. Homeless mentally ill gentleman enters her with complaints of urinary retention, and it is determined he needs a Foley catheter placed. The patient refuses every nurse, except the youngest and most attractive, and proceeds to verbalize to said nurse that she is those things while she places the catheter. After the catheter is in place, and urine is draining, there is a relatively peaceful 15 minutes after which the patient begins to berate staff for the turkey sandwiches not tasting good enough, the blankets not being warm enough, not being quick enough, etc. He proceeds to verbalize, duck this place, rips out his Foley catheter, stands up, walks to the wall right by the entrance to his room, and proceeds to projectile Schmidt all over the wall. He then walks out without telling anyone. Minutes later, another nurse is squatting by the wall, trying to wipe away the damage with tears in her eyes. I have no idea why I went through with becoming a nurse after that. Story 49. 3 days post-major surgery. Most of the tubes have been pulled, but still attached to some monitors. Finally, needed to poop. Nurse responded to my call button, told her I needed help getting into the restroom, asked her if she would disconnect the oxygen monitor from one hand. Other hand still had a needle attached to a long enough tube to allow movement, even into the bathroom. She said she couldn't disconnect the O2 monitor. So I went into the restroom, destroyed the toilet. There may or may not have been some splashage on my backside, thighs, etc. Remember, it had been 4 days since my last bowel movement the day before surgery. I pulled the call button for assistance, and the poor nurse had to wipe down my butt, buttocks to thighs, and get me into a new gown. As she was working, I said, if you would have disconnected the O2 monitor and let me put a glove on over the part attached to my hand, I could have wiped my own butt, and you would not have had to be subjected to this fat, 60-year-old spectacle. The next morning, I again used the call button to get assistance into the restroom, and without commenting, the nurse disconnected the O2 sensor, handed me a glove, and said to ring if I needed anything. I tried to warn her. Story 50. In 2022, I broke my pelvis in the UK. American citizen, so I got to experience the NHS for the first time. Night 1 in the A&E, a drunk man bleeding severely out of the back of his head physically fought with the nurses and threatened other patients before running away. Blood everywhere. I couldn't even sit up, so I was trying to craft a pole to stab him with out of stuff in my backpack and arm's length. Second, an orderly, once I got up into my room, noticed my sink that I couldn't use had a bit of a clog. Maintenance had already been by and said they'd need to send someone else out with more expertise to fix it, but that was fine. The orderly insisted that sometimes these things just need more water and ran the faucet while I begged him to stop. It overflowed black water onto the floor and he said, "Oops," and ran away. No one cleaned it up. Maintenance was gone for the weekend. And later that night, the pipe burst. So I sat in a room with about half an inch of standing black water for hours, until some nurses came and tried to clean it up, put a pan under the broken pipe, and wandered off again. I had to spend a day later with a guy cutting open the entire wall to fix pipes that were probably put in there in the 1800s. Would not recommend. Story 51. This happened in about 2001. My 13-year-old daughter was extremely handicapped. I brought her to the ER, we're in the US, because she was having seizures. This wasn't a new thing for us, and we knew she would be admitted for a few days. She had a pimple on her chin. Since they couldn't be sure it wasn't measles, they wanted to isolate her. I understood and waited for a room. After about an hour, they brought us to her room. They had cleared out a small supply closet and put a large crib and a folding chair in it. After spending days and occasionally weeks in a hospital with her, I knew this wasn't going to work. I checked her out and went to a hospital that knew us and had an isolation room. CODA. The hospital tried everything from pleading and threats to get us to stay. When I explained I would be calling the police and an attorney, they backed off. There were years of legal fights over the bill for her stay. The hospital had our bank accounts frozen and sent constant stream of pay up or else notices. In the end, our insurance company got them to back off. Story 52. Well, when I was in high school, I used to volunteer at the ER to get hours. My first day there, a patient had a code blue, and one of the nurses asked me to bring some things and was allowed to watch from a small distance as they tried to revive him. Unfortunately, he passed away, and I remember later that day, the nurse had me accompany her as we moved his body to a different room, and how casual she was about it, like it was another day. She kept on calling him Mr. Jones, and was all formal and polite before leaving his bed in this one room. A year goes by, and my turn is up. On my last day, I was training a new volunteer, who I found out we shared the exact same birthday and year. During this day, we had a patient in the exact same room as my first day have a code blue, and now I was the one telling this new guy what to help me get and what to see. Then I, without knowing it, took this guy to help me move the deceased patient and was doing the same things the nurse did my first day. IDK, if this counts as weird enough for this post, but I always think about the ridiculous coincidence this had to be to happen. Story 53. Okay, I can tell this one because I saw it in a situation where no privacy protections are on me. In the ER, old man, maybe 80, walking around the halls, escorted by law enforcement. Not cuffed or anything, but escorted. That says psych patient restless, while waiting to be seen and law enforcement that had to bring them in. But think it's a BS reason, so are not worried. In my state, if someone thinks you need to be psych hospitalized, they go to the magistrate and make their case. And if the magistrate agrees, the police come get you and have to wait with you in custody until the mental health examiner comes and evaluates. The law enforcement gets no option about holding you, and sometimes they think it's ridiculous and treat it that way. So Guy is restless and walking the halls. Law enforcement is following a couple of steps behind. A tech walks past, and the old guy jumps her, takes her to the ground, and has her pinned down with his hands around her throat, choking her out. Law enforcement jumps in and is trying to pry him off her. Hospital security comes running, and I got hustled out of the hallway and into an exam room, so didn't see the end. But I bet the law enforcement put him in cuffs after that. Story 54. My grandfather was in the hospital and went into cardiac arrest. As the temporary nursing staff left his room laughing that they cracked Mr. Smith's ribs and worked him over real good, little did they know my grandfather's niece, who was at the time a DA with Harris County, heard everything. HIPAA violations, elder abuse, and more. She was white hot. All the nurses were fired immediately, and the hospital was under investigation for elder abuse and its accreditation. Story 55. If you get pregnant, it is possible for your mammary glands to go into overdrive and grow so much that your skin splits, and you have giant weeping wounds for breasts. It is also possible for fetal placental tissue to have 3 or 4 sets of chromosomes instead of 2 and grow into a malignant, cancerous mass that consumes your uterus. It is also possible for a normal, healthy placenta to grow through the uterus into the surrounding organs, including the bladder. Sometimes there is a mismatch in the placenta-uterus interface that results in small parts of the placenta dying and floating across to the maternal circulation. This causes a systemic response in the mother that can be life-threatening very early in pregnancy. Dead placenta bits floating around in mom's blood can cause liver, kidney, and brain damage, and can lead to a life-threatening seizure. And some folks think that the decision to end a pregnancy should be left up to the state. Story 56. I had an accident where I sliced my leg up real bad, 27 stitches bad. My mom drove me to the hospital. I went into the ER, and there was a lady behind the glass on her phone. I told her I'm hurt real bad and need help. She didn't look up and just mumbled something I couldn't understand. I slapped the glass, leaving a bloody handprint. She still didn't look up until she finished doing whatever she was doing. When she finally did look up, she saw the blood and started to panic. I told the doctor that saw me about her behavior, but I have no idea if anything happened about it. Story 57. Not hospital, but EMS. Went to a patient's house for weakness or lethargy, don't remember which, but our patient is in a home hospital bed, had a DNR, TART, DNI, and is in hospice. He's unresponsive with agonal respirations. We attach our cardiac monitor, and he's only got a rate of 3 or 4 BPM. For our purposes, he's dead. We leave the monitor on for about 30 minutes, waiting for his heart to finally stop. After 30 minutes, the wife asks for a few minutes alone with him before he finally passes. After about 10 minutes, she comes out of the room and tells us that she needs a blanket for him. She tells us that he told her he was cold. Not understanding what she meant, we go back in the room. He is now sitting up and telling us he's cold. This man was dead with no palpable pulse, no heart sounds, minimal electrical activity, and not breathing for over 30 minutes. We then transported him to the ER at his request, and left a living man in the ER room. It was one of the strangest EMS calls I've been on. Story 58. My ma was a nurse passed of lung cancer when I was 16. Then I was taken in by a beautiful lady, an adoptive mom, more or less. Also an RN. Well, she got lung cancer 2 years ago. I was with her at 1 a.m. and she went into a seizure episode of sorts, puking and spazzing. I hit the buzzer, no one came. I ran into the hallway, running up and down, trying to find a nurse. No one there. I heard someone screaming, "Help! God help me!" In another room, no nurses around. So I go back and try to care for this lady and do what I could to ensure her airway was clear and she wasn't hurting herself. Prior to this, she would be waiting for test results, then call her GP, nothing in yet, called the hospital, nothing in yet. Then they'd call and be like, "Have you reached out to schedule an appointment? We've had your test results for 9 days now." From what I saw of how my ma's, with a combined 70 years of nursing passed, if I get cancer, I'll be kissing a shotgun. Inhumane treatment in Canada's world-renowned free healthcare. Story 59. My partner had an injury at work, so had to go to the ear for an x-ray. We were in the waiting room waiting for the results. There was an older couple sitting in front of us, and the woman was getting all huffy about how long everything was taking. Her husband had a sore shoulder. Meanwhile, a family has come in and one by one, gone through to the ed ward and come back out, crying and hugging, obviously just having lost someone. It was heartbreaking to see. And this old keepsing, and I'm thinking, can't you ducking? See, there's more important things happening behind that ducking door? I said to my partner, I have to go. Call me when you're ready to go, because I think I was pretty close to losing my Schmidt at the ignorant old. People seem to think that the ER is a quicker and free, in Australia, version of going to the doctor. It's not. If you are going for something minor, you will wait many, many hours. You are triaged on the basis of emergency. Your sore shoulder can wait. Heart attacks, strokes, asthma attacks, anaphylaxis cannot. Story 60. Took my father to the hospital. He has a condition that requires his meds to be delivered at specific times during the day. Please understand that these times are incredibly important. If you delay one by 10 mins, the next have to be delayed too. Well, I obs couldn't be with him 24/7, and it turned out that they weren't giving him one of his meds at all. They didn't have it in their pharmacy and never bothered to ask me to bring in his from his nursing home. They were charting it, that he was refusing to take it. My father wasn't able to refuse anything in the condition he was in. So, not only was he not receiving this very important medication, they were blaming him. I only found out after a week that this was happening. I want to say I went scorched earth, but as I was not there when he was supposedly refusing the med, I was not able to prove that it was blatant lies. The fact that he was refusing a medicine that they did not have on site apparently was not enough proof. I hate hospitals. Story 61. I was a computer tech working for a hospital. A patient projectile excreted themselves all over one of our workstations on wheels at 5:30 in the morning. My coworker, working the overnight shift, didn't touch that ticket. They just sat there and did duck all and let that ticket sit. I came in at 8:30 and they tell me what happened and that they didn't know what to do. I kindly tell that tech to go home. I walked into a freaking mess, and I am beyond pissed both for the patient who likely is off due to medications, but the fact that medical staff allowed that to stay in the room as the patient. I tore down the workstation on wheels of all equipment and threw out most of the crusty equipment, and I installed all new equipment to get that room back up and running. I documented the hell out that situation and that other tech did not get his contract renewed. Freaking wild. Story 62. Heads up, you probably aren't ever going to get the most insane thing the staff have experienced. We carry that one scarred on our souls and don't share it, not without a lot of work, and then mostly only to our therapists, psychologists, or counselors. Please keep this in mind and go gentle on anyone who does share. There's likely something they thought about and told another story. There's always worse. Story 63. Not the craziest, but a hilarious one I like to tell. I was walking down another unit coming back from my lunch break and stopped to answer a call light because they were busy. The patient was in the bathroom and she was every bit of 600 pounds. And I thought to myself, if she needed help up. Before I could finish my thought, she stands up with ease, turns around, and puts her hands flat on the ground with straight legs and had 300 pounds of ass staring right back at me. She did this without speaking a word to me, and I eventually pieced together that she wanted me to wipe her ass. Afterwards, she walks back to the bed on her own power, pulls her covers up, and still does not say a word to me. Left me ultra perplexed as a newer nurse at the time. Story 64. Had to give my first dose of Narcan. I was punched by the guy when he snapped awake. He immediately knew what was going on and said I owed him $200. For drugs, lost. Had another patient in the ER who was on something like bath salts or something crazy. We had him tied down with leathers, restraints. He busted out of them and was trying to get out of the ER. One thing we can't allow is letting somebody leave with IV access. He was my patient, so I tried to stop him, and basically, I'm being dragged. All the other nurses see what's going on. I'm in California, so all the nurses are Filipino and about 6 to 10 inches smaller than me. One by one, they all pile on, trying to get this guy to stop, and he's dragging us. Finally, the little Filipino secretary, who is the shortest of them all, jumps in the pile and the guy goes down. She exclaimed, "I did it!" So funny. Story 65. Not as exciting as a lot of the other stories, but as a night shift clerk in a NICU. Adults calling in wanting to know if we would do a certain procedure, demanding to be admitted, to speak to the doctor, asking if they can schedule an appointment, asking to speak to my supervisor, or customer service. When I explained that every letter in NICU stands for a reason why the answer to their question is no, and even if hospitals worked like that as the night shift clerk, I am customer service. There's not somebody higher I can transfer them to. It's literally just me. Story 66. I was diagnosed with colon cancer. I would have 6 courses of chemo then, surgery, to remove the tumor. I live in Belgium. My mom lived in California. I asked my doctors if I could make a trip back to California after chemo and before surgery. Doc said, sure, go ahead. I went and saw mom. We visited my sisters. These were COVID times. And most of their families. I had a nice visit with my mom. We went to Costco, Safeway. She pushed the basket around. I flew home on Tuesday to go into hospital Thursday for surgery Friday. Wednesday, about 8 p.m., my sister called and said, our mom's dead, 93 years old. I think she didn't want to deal with my illness and didn't want to outlive any of her kids. I say, well done. She had flair and a way of having her way. I have good thoughts of her. Wish she was still here, but she isn't. Story 67. I had strep throat when I was 16. I made the mistake of telling my doctor I had strep. I had chronic strep, so knew what it was. I hurt his ego, so he refused to test me. Anyway, 5 days and several calls from my mom later, he let me back in the office. My throat had swollen closed, and I couldn't eat or drink. My doctor told me to go to emergency. I spent a week in the hospital being IV-fed antibiotics. Nurses woke me up, probably by accident, from my fever dreams, after which I was apparently swearing. They told me during the day I'd have to leave if I kept swearing, which I don't remember doing. After several days, the doctor, I had decided to lance my throat. On the way out, his hand moved and he cut my lip halfway through. I'm also allergic to that type of penicillin now because of how much they gave me. It was strep. Story 68. Being labeled a drunk and druggy in A&E after I had a cyst ruptured in me. I was given morphine in the ambulance. The nurses didn't even look to check. Said I was just a drunk, shouted at me to just stand up and walk to the toilet. Wouldn't help me. I already can't do this even without morphine as I use a wheelchair. Then when I fell and broke my knee, they laughed as I literally screamed in pain. Then they just discharged me. My husband and I escorted out by police only to have to drive to a different hospital where I was treated properly. And when read my record, it says I was a drunk. And in drugs, looking for more drugs from them, which they obviously removed that and put in a complaint. The nurse on staff was fired and others were sent to training. Spent weeks in bed recovering from it all. Story 69. I was in the hospital for about 3 days in a shared room. On my second night, this dude in his mid-20s gets admitted. He is on the phone with someone telling them that he is septic and is going to die. At about 5 a.m., he's on the phone again, talking about walking out AMA. He leaves right before shift change. The doctor comes in and asks me where the guy went. I told them what he said. He shrugs and says, well, he is going to die, and then leaves. Not super crazy, but it left me saying, what have just happened? Story 70. Combo sad, mildly amusing. I was on an air bay being seen by just the doctor. Busy place. Doctor wants to do an ultrasound on my heart. I had been kicked in the chest by an ice skate. Not intentional. Stuff happens. She grabs the paddle off the machine and it is covered in blood and lube goo. Oops, but it is the ER. Meanwhile, in the bay next to me, separated by a large drape, police are loudly asking, Daryl, who shot you? Daryl, who shot you? While cleaning ultrasound wand, doctor told me Daryl is medicated, would be okay, as he was shot in the butt. This was at 1 hour in the afternoon on a Sunday. I was okay, bruised pericardium, and 2 days in a room. Story 71. As a patient, they were doing an intake on some rich kid when it was explained to him that he would be staying there. Usually they kept you about a week. Don't know if 72-hour minimum applies to pediatric. And we're getting ready to take him to the unit. I was able to see the people in a little double-glazed chicken wire window and could recognize the conversation they were having. Kid kicked a small, heavy table at both of his parents and ran out of the little room and tried to escape. The staff blocked him from the stairs, and he parkoured over the counter onto the unit, stopped in the middle of the hall with the rooms, looked around, and when the other kids laughed at him, cheered, and clapped, he put his hands in his pockets and sat on the floor in the corner and pouted. Story 72. Not insane to me, but may have been for others. Helicopter mechanic here. Had a helicopter based at a large hospital. I had to make my way from helipad to the basement, through a maze of hallways and elevators, to fill my liquid oxygen orb. Often got questions about what it was and all that, which I'd usually answer unless they were really ducking stupid. Told a woman in a crowded elevator that it was an ecto-containment uni, which delighted the guy at the back of the elevator. The best was when a couple of teenagers said something along the lines of, Lee bet it would make a big explosion, after I honestly explained what it was. I then explained that the orb was in fact a strong vacuum containment unit, and finished it up with, but God help us if it does leak. It would suck this whole building out of existence. Kids started hitting buttons to get off now. Story 73. The profound entitlement of some people who come into the ed. Literally had family members standing outside a room while we are doing CPR, demanding blankets or water for their family member, or asking why the nurse hasn't come back yet. Can you not see the 7 people in here doing something kind of important? Also, patients on PCP. Had an old lady, prob late 70s, come in high, weighing maybe 100 LEs. She was in 4-point locking restraints and was able to lift the stretcher and stand up still attached to it. A guy you could smell from down the hallway came in with a huge, oozing leg wound with maggots. We were trying to clean out the wound and he reached down and ate one of the maggots. Story 74. My wife is a CNA, and the unit she worked on, subacute care, had been closed, so she was getting floated around the hospital. I went to visit her or lunch or to drop something off when she was on the critical care telemetry unit, and some guy was freaking out. He had a central line placed in his jugular, but wanted it out. Now say thin, no. He had it in his hand and was threatening to rip it out of a nurse, didn't discharge him right away. 2 nurses descended on him, took him into his room, and the door was closed quickly. I don't know what happened next, but the prospect of watching someone essentially kill themselves by bleeding out was pretty memorably off-putting. Both my wife and my college roommate had witnessed men pull fully inflated catheters out as well, and recounted those stories to me. Story 75. I was in the hospital with C19 in 2020. I am T1 diabetic and I woke up one morning and my BG was 330. The nurse brought my breakfast in and told me I should eat. I asked her for my regular insulin dose, plus a little more to bring my level down. She looked at me like I had a third eye. She said, the doctor has to approve a change of dosage. I said okay and that I would wait to eat until I could get my shot. She sighed and said okay and walked out of the room. About 15 minutes later, someone came in and identified herself as a crisis mental health counselor. She then proceeded to ask me why I was refusing to eat and why I was trying to OD on insulin. I was so pissed.